Good evening. Welcome to Medkai. Thank you very much for coming. Lovely to see a nice big turnout. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Steve Jones, who's our speaker tonight. Steve Jones is Professor of Genetics Emeritus at University College London, where he's been for 40 years. He's one of the world's top 6 experts on the population genetics of land snails, and apparently the other 5 agree. In his spare time, he writes popular science books, and the latest one he has written is The Serpent's Promise, and that's an attempt to rewrite parts of the Bible as a scientific textbook. Professor Jones has had a number of notable awards. In 1996, he was awarded the Royal Society Michael Faraday Prize for Excellence in Communicating Science to UK audiences, and indeed in 2012 he became a Fellow of the Royal Society. He was also awarded the Irwin Prize in 2006 for Secularist of the Year by the National Secular Society. The other thing I must congratulate you on is your success earlier on in the week as chairman of the Tillers at the quiz on BBC Two. One thing which I think is a great mark of outstanding success and achievement, and that is when the BBC decides to cast people away. And Professor Jones was cast away in 1992 by Sue Lawley, but as you can see, I don't know how he did it, but he's managed to get here off the desert island, and enabling him to speak tonight on incest and folk dancing, 2 things to avoid. Professor Jones.
Okay, the first line of the US Army mule training manual is said to read, "First attract the animal's attention by striking it smartly between the ears with a stout stick." That was the reason behind my title, Incest and Folk Dancing, 2 things to avoid, which does tend to attract people's attention, if nothing else. Okay, but it's actually a quotation from Sir Thomas Beecham, and Sir Thomas Beecham, the great conductor, once said, everybody should try everything once. Everybody should try everything once except for incest and folk dancing. And the reason he said that was he hated the music of Percy Grainger, who, as you will well know, arranged a number of English folk tunes as popular piano and orchestral pieces, which Beecham regarded were very trivial. However, I intend to talk not particularly about folk dancing, but more about incest, or at least about inbreeding. And I'll give you a flavour of the lecture by doing a small experiment to start. Can I ask you, if you wish, to shake the hand of the person to your left? You don't have to, but if you would be like to do so, or to your right if you prefer. And for about half of you, I have just introduced you to your 6th cousin. Okay, and that is genuinely the case. For a European population, about 1 person in 2 shares an ancestor with somebody who lived at roughly the time that Darwin had written The Origin of Species. And that's what inbreeding is all about. It's marrying or mating with a relative. And it has a number of interesting evolutionary implications. And as, of course, you know, and maybe we'll even find out some more about, it has a number of medical implications too. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I say in my first year genetics course at UCL, which I have to give every lecture twice. I've given 2 this morning to the students. I started off by saying I'm a geneticist and my job is to make sex boring. And they look blankly at me. We're now on lecture 18, and they know exactly what I mean, I can tell you. But they're actually very confused. I think people are very confused about what sex actually means, and it means something much more subtle than most people think. Most people think that sex actually began with this couple here, Adam and Eve, who committed the first and perhaps the least original of all sins by eating the apple of the tree of knowledge, seeing that they were naked, being chucked out of the Garden of Eden as a result, and procreating in the usual sexual kind of way. And in fact, the idea of original sin is quite close to a lot of genetical ideas. The idea of being born imperfect is a genetical kind of idea, and it is indeed related to the origin of sex, as we will see. So that's Adam and Eve, and they look notably different from each other. They have some graceful vegetation to hide the details, but of course there are stereotypical images of what males and females all are. This really is Steve Jones. It's not me. It's not me. But it's a stereotypical image of what every man secretly wants to be: big, brutal, rather aggressive-looking, impressive posing pouch, that kind of stuff. A student once asked me, "Have you not been well, Professor Jones? I fear I have never looked like this." And this chap is a bodybuilder, and like many bodybuilders, I don't think he does, but many other bodybuilders certainly do. They abuse they become the ultimate element of maleness all across the animal kingdom, large and aggressive compared to the opposite sex, the females. And there are plenty of animal equivalents of that Steve Jones. Here's one. This is a sea elephant. And this is a male sea elephant, which is 5 times bigger than the female. It's a dangerous life being a male sea elephant. What actually happens is only 1 in 5 males born makes it to be adults. The rest are killed by other males. And only 1 in 5 of the survivors actually has any offspring. So there's a huge competition among males for access to females, which Darwin gave rise to sexual selection. This sea elephant is showing a particularly male attribute because he's wasting all his sexual energies on a bunch of penguins, which isn't going to do his sexual genetic future much good. And this sea elephant and Steve Jones are both filled with this hormone testosterone, which is, of course, dangerous stuff. Women have testosterone in much smaller amounts, which is why elderly ladies sometimes grow moustaches. But men have a lot, and it's dangerous stuff. If you abuse it, you have much higher risk of suicide, murder, car crashes, that kind of stuff. But the patterns of life across the life course show its risks. Here's the mortality rate with age for men and women, men in blue, women in red. And you can see at all ages, from the very youngest at least, men die at a higher rate than women. They die from accidents at a much higher rate than women. 4-year-old boys are killed by accidents at twice the rate of 4-year-old girls. Men, and I can assure you this is correct, men are struck by lightning at 3 times the rate of women. And that isn't because there is a gene that attracts thunderbolts. It's because men do those masculine things, standing on a golf course with a lightning conductor in their hand, or climbing a mountain, or actually working outside. Men are murdered at 10 times the rate of women, and they get back their own back by murdering at 10 times the rate of women, particularly when they're at the age when they want to show what good husbands they might make, the age of 20 or so. And the testosterone, of course, also suppresses the immune system. So it's expensive stuff. But actually, it's not the element of maleness. It's not what sex really means at all. Because in the animal kingdom as a whole, most females are larger than most males. Here's an extreme example of it. This is a fish called the anglerfish. And the anglerfish was for a long time thought to be a parthenogen. Virgin birth, all female, gave rise and without males. That isn't true. The males are, you can see them here, they're sidling up to the large female. And what they do is they attach themselves to the female and reduce themselves to a sack of guts and genitals. What more, one says, can any male want? And the female then decides, in a way we don't know, to use one of those sacs of sperm to fertilize her own eggs. So when it comes to maleness and femaleness, size really doesn't really come into it. The same is true about genetics. We all know about the Y chromosome, and I won't bore you with the details of the Y chromosome. We all know about the SRY gene, but sex determination can happen in lots and lots of different ways. In birds, for example, the females, in effect, are XY, and the males are XX, so that's not the same. And you can have environmental sex determination. This is a fish called the blue-finned wrasse, which is a North American fish. The males at the bottom, as you can see, a big pectoral fin and a blue tail. And what it does is one male guards a harem of females and tries to keep other males out. It doesn't actually usually succeed, but it tries. If you bring that group into the lab and take the male out, then there's a moment of chaos, needless to say. But after a few days, one of the females looks a bit shifty, and she turns herself into a fully functional male. who fertilizes her erstwhile sisters. And that's sex determination almost by embarrassment. She was the top dominant female, and her hormonal change is such to make a male. And that seems odd, but it's not that odd, because you know that people, men and women under extreme stress, do have big changes in their steroid hormones, and that's exactly what happens here. And there are various other ways you can deal with it too, including differences in the size of sperm and egg and that kind of stuff. But all this stuff is just detail, really. What's really germane to my talk is the basic thing, the most surprising, universal, and inexplicable thing about sex is that sex involves every individual having two parents. And when you realize that in evolutionary terms, a difference in reproductive success of a fraction of 1% over the generations leads to long-term evolution, you're faced with a big problem. Why do women allow men to get away with it? Why do females allow males to hijack their own female machinery to copy male genes? And it's by no means clear why that is. There are various theories, but that's the central point. But it's also the case, because every individual has two parents, you immediately run into what we might call a demographic problem. This is a picture of the apocalypse, and we all know about the apocalypse. At the end of time, we will all be gathered together and judged, and those who go to nice, God-fearing universities like King's College London will all go to heaven, and we atheists in Gower Street, the godless college of Gower Street, as it's sometimes called, UCL, we will all burn in hell. And we all know that's going to happen, and we've learned to live with it. Okay. It actually comes from a real historical event. It comes from the sacking of the city of Megiddo, which is in northern Israel, by King Sargon of the Assyrians in 722 BC. Okay. And the inhabitants, the survivors, were driven out. They became the lost tribes of Israel, actually. And they grew up among their descendants the idea that at the end of time, whenever that might be, they and everybody else who had ever lived would be gathered together on the plain of Megiddo, Armageddon, and judged whether they go up or down. Okay. And you can work out from simple arithmetic how many people might be there. Well, we all have two parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-greats, 32, 64, 128, 56. And if we say that there are 100 generations of humans, which is roughly right, since 722 BC, and you go 2, 4, 8, 16, 2 to the 100th times, you end up with something like 100 billion people on who will assemble on the plane of Earth, on the plane of Megadon. That's all the people who are descended from the original ancestors in the city, and everybody who has lived in between them. And that would be a ball of flesh as big as the Earth, expanding at the speed of light. And although, Britain, London is getting a pretty crowded place, it's not as crowded as that. So clearly there's something wrong in our calculation. And what's obviously wrong in our calculation is that we share ancestors. We have to share ancestors. We have no choice but share ancestors with the person sitting next to us or a person in Tibet, simply because there's no room on the family tree to fit in all the answers that would be needed. Okay, and that's so we're all inbred to a greater or lesser extent. And in fact, if you zigzag back through the male and female lines, not father, grandfather, great-grandfather, but father, his mother, her father, his father, and so on. You get back to what we call a coalescent, a universal ancestor of everybody on Earth, remarkably recently, about 4000 BC, which is, of course, the time worked out by 3000 BC, which is about the time worked out by Archbishop Usher of when the Garden of Eden actually existed in 4004 BC. So I put that to you with no claims that it proves the literal truth of the book of Genesis. So there's plenty of inbreeding, and what does it do? Well, what it does is it unites us into tight family groups, and you can show that in various ways. The effect was first shown by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. And Galton, who was an extremely clever man, is perhaps most notorious for having founded the science, if you can call it that, of eugenics, which led to various dreadful events, as we all know. But he was interested in human quality, and he did a lot of work on human quality. He was a very early anthropometrist. He measured height, weight, strength of grip, rowing ability, I don't know why he chose drawing ability. He's the only person, as far as we know, to have made a beauty map of the British Isles, and we still have at UCL the little brass counting device he kept in the palm of his hand and stalked the streets of the local cities, scoring the local females on a 5-point scale from attractive to repulsive. And he made this map. The low point, I have to tell you, was in Aberdeen. I once gave this talk in Aberdeen, and I'm rather mistaken. He said where it still is, and that didn't go down well. And the high point is where it still is in South Kensington in London. Okay, I don't think he ever came to Nottingham, so you're safe. So he was interested in quality, and he was like Darwin, who was a very rich man, worth about £70 million in modern terms when he died. He was well off, and he had the habit of going on walking holidays in the late 19th century in the Italian-speaking parts of Switzerland. And then, unlike now, that was a very poor part of the world filled with isolated villages scattered up in the mountain valleys. And Galton turned up one day on his first holiday, landed in a little village with 20 people in it, and he discovered something odd, and you should brace yourself for a terrible joke. He discovered that everybody in the village had the same surname. It could have been spaghetti, shall we say. Okay. So he was curious about that, he noted it, climbed over the mountain to the next village, equally remote, equally isolated. Everybody had the same surname in there, but it was a different one, it was pasta. And then the next one, cannelloni, and so on and so forth, till you run out of different kinds of Italian starchy food. And initially, he thought, well, that's bizarre. There must be some big advantage to being called spaghetti in Village 1 and pasta in Village 2. What is it? So he went back into the family records of this place, and it became immediately obvious what was happening. It was because the pattern of inheritance of surnames, in the Western system at least, is the same as the pattern, roughly speaking, as the pattern of inheritance of Y chromosomes. A father passes his surname to his son and to his daughter, but his daughter changes her name on marriage. Now, we used to change her name on marriage. So what you end up with is the following. Let's imagine you have a village with 22 individuals, and Galton wanders into it, and they're all called spaghetti. In the previous generation, it's always been 22 individuals. The previous generation, 4 men had no sons. Okay, they might have had all daughters who changed their names, or they may have been childless. So their names disappear. So there are only 18 ancestors of those 22. And you go back another generation, it goes to 16, and you can keep going back further and further in the system until finally you get to the coalescent ancestor, this chap here, who's known as the last universal common ancestor, or alternatively as the most recent common ancestor, and that's him, and he must have been called Mr. Spaghetti. Okay, there were 21 other surnames in the village at the time, but they all went extinct when the male lines went extinct. Every man in the village has got the original Mr. Spaghetti's Y chromosome, but every man and every woman in the village has got large amounts of his DNA, because this has now become a rather inbred population where everybody is related to each other. And which name takes over is purely random. It would be a different name in a different village. But each village will be inbred in a different way, which means they will be genetically distinct for accidental reasons to do with producing male or female offspring. Now, as I said, everybody in this room is evidence of that fact. But in Galton's time, Galton was convinced of the fact, was sure of the fact, that inbreeding was in fact a very dangerous thing to do, that cousin marriages were in fact dangerous. And he wasn't entirely wrong. Now, we have fortunately some human equivalents of fruit flies, which are known as royal families, okay? And they're very useful. We're all royalists, we geneticists, because royal families define themselves by genetic means, by shared descent, by being on a common pedigree. And if you have, the word pedigree, as all you polymathic Nottinghamians will know, comes from the French word pied de grue, which means the crane's foot, and it spreads out like this, like a spreading tree, splitting up more and more. But it doesn't, of course, because of the shared ancestor thing. They actually share ancestors. And if you draw a pedigree, for example, of King Charles II of Spain of the mid-17th century, you see lots of loops in it, okay? And these loops show shared ancestors. And you can see some of his shared ancestry was really quite close. I mean, his parents was an uncle, his parents was an uncle-niece marriage, okay? And those loops build up, and they lead to rapid build-up of genetic homogeneity. Now, the Bourbon family of Spain were famously potty, and you can see perhaps why. Here are the number of ancestors which various Spanish and other aristocrats had. At the 7th generation, which is 2 to the 7th, 128. And you can see, for example, Alfonso XII, King of Spain, at 7 generations back, instead of having 128 ancestors, he only had 8. Okay? And indeed, at 4 generations back, Francesco Macena only had 2 ancestors. So this is extreme inbreeding. And this led to the madness of kings in Spain. And in fact, it led Alfonso to marry Queen Victoria's daughter, Ina, and in order to get some good British blood into the family. And he was quite blatant about this. Unfortunately, Ina was a carrier of haemophilia, and that led to haemophilia in the Spanish royal family, which is still there in its more remote branches. But that's extreme inbreeding. Now, that's inbreeding which are kind you don't really often see. The British royal family, Victoria and Albert, say, are not as loopy as the Spaniards were, but they're still pretty inbred, okay? And we have lots and lots of data. But you don't need much inbreeding if you have enough time to allow a lot of it to build up. Here, for example, are the patterns of descent of Prince Charles, the man with the ears and the expression of baffled rage, and his ex-wife, Diana. Their patterns of descent as recorded by royalists who do nothing but send me emails about royal descent from Edward III, who lived in the 14th century. And you can trace 3,000 different lines of descent to Charles, and from Charles to Edward, and 4,000 lines from Di to Edward. She was, in fact, probably more aristocratic than Charles was. Charles was a bit of an arriviste, which means inevitably that their children, Harry, for example, no, he's William, isn't he, that one, will have double copies of alleles variants born by Edward III, some indeed of which may be harmful in double copy. Okay, so the effect it depends not only on the closeness of inbreeding, but how long it's gone on. And a brief episode of inbreeding can lead to a large degree or to very lasting effects. And here's a real pedigree I picked out of a paper which appeared a few months ago about the inheritance of early onset Alzheimer on an isolated Dutch island. And you can see what a real pedigree actually looks like. You know, far from looking like a crane's foot, it looks more like a fishing web. There are loop after loop after loop. So the overall inbreeding coefficient of this population is extremely high. And it's been known for a long time that if you inbreed, you pay a price. The price, at first sight, seems rather minor, because what happens is, as we saw in the diagram with the surnames and the spaghetti, you lose genetic variation. But what that often means, of course, as everybody here will know, that you may end up having 2 copies of otherwise harmful recessive alleles. And as I also say to my students, and they never laugh, if I had brought my magic Mendelian wand with me and I waved it over the audience, and I made everybody in this room homozygous, double copies of a single copy harmful allele, everybody in the room would die between 3 and 4 times. So every single one of us carries 3 or 4 lethal equivalents, as they're called, hidden away behind a good copy of an allele. But if you have 2 of the same, then you're in big trouble. And you can see that in animal breeding. This is the collie. And it's Crufts this week, okay? And this is the collie inbreeding with time. Dog breeders are, as far as I can see, completely mad. One of their standard breeding patterns is to take a dog. They used to think that the bitch isn't important. It's just the dog that matters. So they would mate it with some other female. Take its daughters, mate her with her father, take her daughters, mate them with her grandfather, and get immediate massive inbreeding. And very quickly, you get the double-up copies of things like myopathies, which are muscle weakness diseases, and early death. The BBC this year has gone back to Crufts, somewhat to my surprise, because about 5 years ago, they made a program called Pedigree Dogs on Bell, which actually I was on. 2 elderly ladies who started off on BBC 3, utterly obscure, then it went to BBC 4, then it went to BBC 2, and then it went to BBC 1. So it was a remarkably good program. And it just showed the shocking things which people are willing to do with dogs. For example, with King Charles Spaniels, which are these animals with flat faces and bulging eyes, and that lap dogs like King Charles Spaniels are often bought by perhaps elderly ladies because they look a bit like babies. That's what they're selected for looking neotenous. And the King Charles Spaniel has a very flat face, so what happens is its brain basically gets pushed back into its spinal cord and traps the spinal cord, and you can see the poor animal's had its back of its head opened up here. And they're quite blithe about doing this, and they were quite shocked that the BBC said, in that case, we're not going to show the show anymore. It's so cruel, and it is incredibly cruel. But this year they've had a change of policy, I don't know why, and they've gone back. So the effect can be quite big. Now, it's also the case, as I said, that an episode of inbreeding, perhaps in the distant past, can have a long-lasting effect. Here's some maths. I won't bore you with it in detail. What you need to work out the intensity of inbreeding is the mean population size, or the population size. In a tiny village, you're going to get spaghettis much quicker than in an enormous village, okay? And you use a special kind of mean that's called the harmonic mean. Let's imagine, it comes from economics originally. Imagine that you have a population of a medieval village with, let's say, 1 millionaire in it, okay, and 99 peasants who make £100 a year. The average income will be something like, I can't do this off my head, £800 a year. But that doesn't mean anything, okay, because it's all in the millionaires. This is all like Mayfair. There's lots of poor people in Mayfair, but there's a few millionaires. So it seems as if it's very rich. So you need to take particular notice of extreme values. And this is an example of a population which is fluctuating in numbers, and it's a bit unreasonable. It's 1,000 one generation, 1,000 the next generation, 1,000 the next generation. Then it goes down to 10. Then it goes up magically to 1,000 again. So there are 5 generations. The arithmetic mean is 802, but the harmonic mean, which is k, the number of generations, over the number in generation 1 all the way through to the one in generation 5, is 48. So that one bottleneck, perhaps long ago, has had a marked effect. And you can see that again and again. Here's a diagrammatic case of that. These are Amish, and the Amish went to what became the United States in the early 18th century, most of them, and they were Anabaptists. They came from Switzerland and from southern Germany. They believed in adult baptism. Lots of people were killed for believing in adult baptism. So they fled. They were persecuted, and like many religious isolates, they then started doing a bit of persecuting of their own when they got to the United States. And initially they were very rare. We think there probably only about 40 people came to the US, and they didn't. And recently, before 1850, there were only about 7 or 8 colonies. And most of those have gone extinct. Since 1902, on the other hand, they've been very busy. Okay, these are the number of colonies since 1990. The red dots, the total number of colonies, and the mean completed family size is 6. And these are the number of Amish from 1900, when there were probably 5,000 of them, to 2014, when there are 220,000. And by 2050, at that rate, there will be as many Amish as there are people in the United States as a whole. So they went through a bottleneck long ago. There are now huge numbers of them. And as a result of that bottleneck, that brief bottleneck, they have high frequencies of otherwise rare genetic diseases. I think here, Ellis von Creveld syndrome, which is found only in the Amish. Okay? So these bottlenecks, historical bottlenecks, are genuinely very important because of past inbreeding. Now, not all inbreeding is past inbreeding. There are some spectacular examples of recent inbreeding. Here's the pedigree of Tutankhamun. Okay? Now, of course, all European monarchs used to believe in the divine right of kings. They were chosen by God to rule, and they believed that to be absolutely true. I believe that our British royal family doesn't think that. Maybe they do secretly, but they don't admit it to people. But in Tutankhamun's time, in Egypt, they went a step further. They thought they were gods, okay? And if you're a god, the last thing you want to do is to pollute your divine bloodline with some human DNA, as we would say today. So in Tutankhamun's time, brother-sister matings were quite common. Okay, and you can see that Tutankhamun himself actually married his sister, mated with his sister. He was the offspring of a brother-sister mating, and they were offsprings of a brother-sister mating. Okay, so there's a great deal of inbreeding here. Now, when Tutankhamun died, quite reasonably in those days, his wife was killed and buried with him. She was pregnant and had 2 fetuses, which have now been opened up and looked at. And if you took his an X-ray of his skeleton, it's clear that he had a severe skeletal problems of different kinds, almost certainly because he is so intensely inbreeding. So it's an interesting issue, inbreeding. How are we going to measure it? Well, we can measure it in lots of different ways. some of which are direct because you've got pedigrees, which go back a long way, some of which are more subtle, and in fact turn on surnames, as we'll see in a moment, and some of which is simply going out and asking people around who they've married and trying to make crude maps of patterns of inbreeding. So let's talk about the pedigree case. Here's a picture I took 15 years ago when I made a television series of a young lady in Finland. Variant late infantile neurolipofascidosis is what she's got. Finland is an extraordinary country in many ways. For most of history, it was a few islands of people surrounded by a sea of trees. And Finns have a genetic history fairly distinct from the rest of Europe. Now, genetic history of Europe has become rather contentious in the last 3 or 4 years. But the Finns still stand out as somewhat of an outlier because an awful lot of European genes came from the Middle East at the time of farming and spread into Europe. Some of it may have come from north of the Black Sea. But the Finns seem to have come mainly from Asia and come across the northern parts of Siberia into Finland. And they have 33 inherited recessive genetic conditions found nowhere else in the world. And there's a huge interest in genetics in Finland. Some very, very good population genetics has been done there. And this is one of them, a very unfortunate disease. I'm afraid the young lady will no longer be with us. It's a nervous degenerative disease, which means that the nervous system basically poisons itself. Okay. And if you draw a map, it's clear that it's actually linked to a particular part of Finland, which is called Ostrobothnia, in the southwest of Finland. And all of them like that, they're patchy. Now, the Finns also have extraordinarily effective pedigree patterns because the Lutheran Church, which they all used to belong to, keeps precise records of who marries whom. And so you can chase the ancestry of that young lady. Here she is in B. That's her. She's got 2 copies of the otherwise hidden gene. The parents, by definition, must have 1 copy each. And every single case of this gene we can trace back, or almost trace back, to the same individual who lived at some time in the 17th century. We can't make all the links. In A, there's one where we can't make the links. But that gene has traveled down the many paths, and you can see there's lots of loops in that pedigree until finally they came together in that unfortunate young lady. So that's one way of measuring inbreeding. However, you don't often have as much information as that. But you do have information which you can gain from asking people. And if you go out and ask who's marrying whom, you can make a global map of inbreeding. This is some work done by an ex-colleague of mine called Bittles, who's now gone to Australia. And there are striking differences in the overall frequency of consanguinities, it's called, consanguineous marriages, to the extent that if you were to take 2 random people in Pakistan and ask them to shake hands with the person next to them, they wouldn't be 6th cousins on average. They would be 1st cousins once removed. Okay, so that's that kind of effect. They're much, much more inbred. So that's many generations of inbreeding. And the overall frequency of consanguineous marriages, that's marriages of 2nd cousins and closer, it goes up above 50% in Saudi Arabia, above 50% in Afghanistan, and is way down at about 0.5% in places like Western Europe. So there are big, big differences from place to place. Indeed, in Saudi Arabia, one of the common marriage patterns is uncle-niece. You marry your brother's daughter, and that's closer than cousin marriage. So understandably, that has health effects. And it's particularly unfortunate that in many parts of the Middle East, there are high incidences of particular genetic diseases. The thalassemias, which are deletions in the hemoglobin alpha or beta, which evolved there, a bit like sickle cell in Africa and India, to protect against malaria. And there are now major attempts by the governments of those countries, including rather repressive governments like Saudi Arabia, to advise people of the dangers of cousin marriage. And they're having some success there, there's no question. It's a slightly different story. But the effect isn't just on specific diseases, it's on overall health. Here are the patterns of child health in the British Pakistani population. In fact, the population of Bradford, who've been there for 50 or 60 years now, and the 2nd generation, if not more by now. And they're inbred, and in fact, there's in some sense, some of them are more inbred than their native Pakistani population, because in the early days, there was strong pressure for the younger generation to bring their cousins and so on in from Pakistan to join their family. So there's lots of inbreeding, and you can see this is child health. You can see really quite striking differences in childhood disability, let's say, between the two, almost a doubling of early death. So it's a big effect. It's not a small effect. I have to say, in Bradford, there's a very effective organisation called Better Bradford, which is run by the Pakistani community and attempts to focus on this problem and informs people about the difficulties. But it doesn't alter the fact that the problem remains there. There's a much more ingenious way of measuring inbreeding, which Charles Darwin thought of. Charles Darwin was a very, very clever fellow. And he realised that one statement of inbreeding, which maybe he got the idea from Galton, was to ask how many surnames are there in a population in relation to the number of people in the population. Now, that's easy research to do, because all you need is a phone book. And if you go to the New York Manhattan phone book, you find that the average number of people who share the same surname in Manhattan is 3. That's all, okay? Most of them are ones, but the average is 3. If you go to do the same in Oslo, the average is 1,500, okay, which tells you that Manhattan, which people all over the world, is much more outbred than Oslo is. And you can do it in Britain. The strange obese pattern of this map was done at UCL, and it's weighted by population for obscure reasons. The warmer the colour, the more surnames there are in relation to population size. And London, you can see is pretty warm. Nottingham's pretty warm. Cambridge is actually less inbred than I would have imagined. It's got some certain number. But if you go to the far north of Scotland and the Hebrides and West Wales, you see there's far fewer surnames there, which might, as we'll see, reflect patterns of inbreeding. So that's one way of doing it, just counting surnames. But then Darwin, or I think it was George Darwin, his son, came up with an even better idea, which is to ask about patterns of marriage of two people with the same surname. And if you decide to marry somebody who you don't know initially, who has the same surname as you, particularly if it's a rare surname, it's highly likely that you descend from the same individual. And this is the method of what's called isonomy. And it's easy to get data because in all the marriage registers the data is there, name of husband, name of wife. So plenty of isonomy went on. And it is genetics, it turns on genetics. Let's take, for example, a rare name like Attenborough. Okay? Now, Attenborough means by the fort, Attenberg. It probably arose somewhere not very far from here, probably in about the 12th century. We don't know which particular fort it was. It was in the Midlands somewhere. And somebody asked a number of Attenboroughs, something like 500 of them, to give swabs, and they looked at their Y chromosomes, and you can see for the Attenboroughs there, yep, they are indeed, for their Y chromosomes, all closely related to each other. One or two embarrassing exceptions we don't go into in detail when we're talking to David Attenborough, but in fact they aren't necessarily embarrassing exceptions. Quite often it have been unrecorded adoptions. People sometimes in the old days, if they had no sons, they would ask one of their neighbours to change their son's name to their surname and leave their money to that son. So that happened. So that's the Attenboroughs. So the shared surname is really telling you something about shared genes. There's no question about that. Now, a name like Smith, on the other hand, where there are 560,000 Smiths, they don't share, that's the family tree of the Smith Y chromosome up the top there. And there's no relatedness at all, because every village had its man who bashed horses' hooves and did all the metalwork in the village, and he was called Smith. So these are independent origins. So it only works for rare surnames. But there's a remarkable parallel between Darwin's thoughts about isonomy and some fairly new research in genetics. Okay. Now, as I say, if two people with the same surname, rare surname, marry, they probably descend from a recent common ancestor. And here we've got in red Mr. Attenborough and Ms. Attenborough, who are going to get together, and they share a common identifier, which is about 14 letters long. Okay? Now, fair enough. But of course, DNA is a surname too. Y chromosome is obviously a surname because the Y chromosome doesn't break and reshuffle, doesn't recombine with the X apart from the very tips of the Y chromosome. But actually, along the length of the DNA too, it's not all broken up like a hand of cards every time sperm and egg are made. In fact, great blocks of DNA pass down the generation, and only very occasionally are they broken up by this process that's called recombination, the breakage and rejoining of segments of DNA on the same chromosome into new combinations that are mixtures of mother and father. That does happen, there's no question. It has to happen to allow sperm and egg to be made, but it doesn't happen all the time. So what happens is, if you find a child with two long blocks of doubled up identical DNA, it's highly likely that that child descends from somebody not long ago in the path, down in a path that passes through its mother and father, because there hasn't been long enough for those long blocks to be broken up and reshuffled. So the longer the block in this particular child, the more inbred that individual might be. And in fact, now you've got a tool, which is technically an easy tool to use, where you can measure precisely the inbreeding level in any population, any family, any individual you like. And you get some interesting effects. Here's a pedigree, or the DNA scan, of a German young lad who's in a home. I don't know whether he's still with us, but he was very severely compromised. He was the son of a brother-sister mating, an incestuous mating, okay? And he had many, many medical problems. And if you look along his DNA, chromosome 1, 2, 3, and so on, you can see huge blocks in green of doubled-up, identical DNA copies. And many of those doubled-up copies will give him 2 copies of recessive, harmful variants. And no wonder he's in such trouble. But of course, brother-sister mating is very, very rare. It happens, but it's very occasional. So that's exceptional. But as I say, what you can do is you can now go in and you can start looking at different populations to see what's going on. And that was first done about 10 years ago in Hrvatska, Croatia, where I did my PhD, as it happens, on the snails of Croatia. I will answer questions on the snails of Croatia at the end of this talk, if you wish. And what it was, I did it in the 60s, and it was a really wild and woolly place. Mind you, it got wilder and woollier after that. It was done particularly on these islands of Brač, Hvar, and Korčula, which are now holiday islands, which for many, many years were isolated, suspicious, inward-looking communities where people tended to marry the people on the island. Okay. And what was done, and quite speculatively really, by a bunch of British and Croat geneticists, was to go in and see, well, what does these people's DNA look like? And I'll have to talk you through this. By any chance, do we have a pointer? We have a pointer. Do we have a pointer? This is a real UCL experience. We have a pointer, but the battery's flat. Doesn't really matter. What we've got here are several groups of people shown as coloured bars from the islands, Dalmatia, from the Croatian mainland, from Scotland, from Europe as a whole. And what I've generated in this diagram is part of a much bigger diagram, which shows the number of people who have long doubled-up DNA blocks, runs of homozygosity, as they're known, of different lengths. And it turns out that everybody from Europe and so on, almost everybody in this room, has got doubled-up lengths of DNA up to 2.5 million base pairs long. Okay, so they go back probably to a quite distant ancestor, maybe a 6th or 7th or 8th cousins. But when we look at the extreme at the right there, doubled-up lengths of DNA more than 10. Thanks. Great, thank you. Lengths of DNA more than 10 million base pairs long. There's an interesting pattern. These are the endogamous Dalmatians. These aren't dogs, they're people from Dalmatia who are endogamous. They marry within the community on the islands. And something like 30% of them have got doubled-up lengths of DNA more than 10 million base pairs long. The green ones, mainland Croats, and the Croats and Croatia's mountainous and isolated villages, they're pretty inbred too. If you go to the Central Europe, which is the general European population, here, you'll see that almost nobody has got blocks as long as that. But interestingly enough, these people here are people from Orkney, okay, in the north of Scotland. And nobody knew this, but actually the Orcadians, the people of Orkney, are remarkably inbred. It's an isolated place, but nobody really realised how inbred they were. So we've got this tool, and if you look at the family history, particularly on those islands, the F, the inbreeding coefficient, measured by genes, it represents precisely the F inbreeding coefficient, which you can work out from the pedigrees and the marriage registers. So it's a powerful tool, and it turns out to have a number of perhaps important implications. That's the correlation between F from pedigree, inbreeding from pedigree, and F from runs of homozygosity, as they're called, and you can see it's really precisely the same. Now, soon after that it was discovered that there are a number of correlations they're not absolute, but they're there, between people who have a variety of inborn conditions and the number of blocks of doubled up long DNA that they have, runs of homozygosity. And this was the first one. This is colon cancer patients in the United States. And that's in A, and the chromosomes 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 all the way to 22. The blocks are the runs. And you can see, if you compare the CRC, the colon cancer patients, with the controls, who are healthy patients, healthy people in a control population, it's pretty obvious that there are many, many more doubled-up blocks in those cancer patients, okay? It's also the case that quite different genes have the same issue. If we take people with severe autism compared to people with milder autism, that's the blue line, exactly the same pattern. You get many more long doubled-up runs of homozygosity in kids with severe autism than with milder autism, and also in another totally different condition, you get early onset Parkinson's disease, which is a movement issue with a strong heritability. It turns out that if you take people with early onset Parkinson's disease and you ask how many more of them have got long doubled up more than 10 megabase lengths of DNA, at the bottom right there, you can see the blue ones, who are the early onset people. They've got twice as many, or 3 times as many, or 3 times as many of them have got those as the control population. Whereas when we're looking at short lengths, there's no real difference between them. So the ratio goes shooting up, okay? And it goes even further than that. In Finland, papers just come out, which takes people with long runs of homozygosity and asks about their psychological state and general health. They're shorter, poorer, less healthy, less well-educated, less happy and less satisfied with life than are Finns with fewer of these things. I have to say, I haven't read this paper in depth. It sounds like you might have a bit of a problem with what we call stratification. These may be people who live in villages which are poor compared to people who work for Nokia in Helsinki. So I don't really know how strong this is. But there may be something there. But what we've clearly got is a tool which really is, I think, potentially quite a powerful indicator of future general well-being. And the idea that we could actually use the Human Genome Project, which as we all know has been largely a complete bloody waste of money, to pick out individuals at risk of rare diseases like cystic fibrosis. You can do this, but of course these diseases are rare. But this kind of thing may apply to the population as a whole. So I think it will become quite an important tool in diagnosis. The question arises then, if we've got in that state, where are we going to go from now? Well, I could say an awful lot more about patterns of inbreeding across the globe. It turns out that Africans are much more outbred than the rest of the world. Why is that? Because Africans have been there moving around in Africa in large numbers for many years without any bottlenecks. In 1987, myself and a Iranian physicist friend of mine, Shaheen Rouhani, were the first people to work out the size of the bottleneck of individuals who got out of Africa to fill the rest of the world. And the answer we came up with was 14, okay? And that was published in Nature. Nobody has ever bloody well referred to it, to my fury. There's now a whole industry that does this, and the size of the bottleneck, comparing the genes of Africa versus the genes outside Africa, with lots of very advanced mathematics, has gone up to 22. So, so we were right, okay? So that Africans are much less inbred than the rest of the world because they haven't been through this bottleneck. North Americans, Native Americans, particularly in the southern part of the Americas, are much more inbred again because only about 18 people made it 20,000 years ago across the Bering Land Bridge. So we have these big patterns across the world too. And the question arises then, what's going to happen in the future? And it's clear that something very new is happening to the human population because no longer are we marrying the boy or the girl next door because we have no choice. Arguably, the most important event in human evolution, in human genetics, was the invention of the bicycle. You can leap on your bicycle, and you can pedal away, and you can marry a pastor from the next village or a cannelloni from the next village but one. And in a city like London, of course, as I look at my extremely racially mixed first-year class, it's absolutely striking what's going on. In London, of all the children under 16 with one Afro-Caribbean parent, half of those children, in half of those cases, the other parent is white. So now we've got a situation where two really biologically fairly different groups are mixing and melding together very, very quickly. There are no real there are no barriers between them. What's much more important in choosing your mate in London or anywhere else is not your skin colour anymore, but your education level. You're 6 times more likely to marry somebody of a different race, if you want to use that word, and the same education level, be it PhD or leaving school at 15, than you are to marry somebody of the same race, you with a PhD and her with a left school at 15. So it's a big, big effect. There are other barriers, of course. They're what William Blake called the mind-forged manacles, by which he meant religion, and there are barriers between Islamic believers and people who believe in other faiths. So they're still there. But generally, these barriers are breaking down. And you can see that in many ways. You can see it, and this is an over-analysed piece of data, if you ever saw one. Somebody got his computer, and then he got a ruler and a pencil and drew a straight line. But they took the DNA runs of homozygosity in specimens from the US, pathological specimens from 1900 to 2000, and you can see the amount of outbreeding that's gone on. But you can do more than that. You can do it yourselves. You can ask how far apart was the birthplace of you and your partner, if you have one, compared to the birthplace of your mother and your father, your mother's mother and your mother's father, and so on. And generally speaking, you have a dramatic difference. My case is fairly extreme. My wife and I was born in West Wales. My wife was born in Manhattan, 3,000 miles away. My parents were born 3 miles apart. And once, to my eternal shame, some cocky little student shouted from the audience, "And it shows." So that effect is really quite big. So, and you can measure the amount of inbreeding by the marital distance, as it's called. But of course, you don't need to get on your bicycle anymore. Even if you get on your bicycle, you can begin to move quite fast. This is the surname, Jones, in West Wales, in 1881. And all the Joneses were safely tucked behind Offa's Dyke. Okay, this is a map again made at UCL. You have to make 1% of the population in order to get onto this map, right, in any particular county. And Jones is actually a rather recent name. It only appeared in the 18th century when the nasty English invaders, the immigrants, came and made us change the Welsh system, which had been naming yourself after your father, Pew, Parry, and that kind of stuff. It's like the Hebrew system. But that was changed. But the Joneses were still stuck in West Wales. 1881, but that's the pattern. In 1998, we were on the move. Okay, the Joneses and their genes were definitely on the move. We hadn't quite made it to Nottingham. I live in hope. We had made it to Oxford, surprisingly, and we show no signs whatsoever of making it to Cambridge. So you could do that. And of course, surnames are moving across the world massively, as we can see. But it's going to happen much, much more. Here we've got the patterns of movement and the 747, sex and the 747. And now we've really got a situation where the most unlikely people are setting up together and mating. So we're entering an era where inbreeding is much less important, at least in the westernized parts of the world, than it ever has been. And some people suggest quite seriously that that is partly responsible, for example, for the great increase in the height of the present generation of students compared to my generation of students. I mean, when I went to Edinburgh, when I came to UCL, which is in the early 1970s, at least I could look the female students in the eye. Now I can't even do that. The girls are taller than I am. And that could partly be due to inbreeding. It'd be a nice little project for somebody to do runs of homozygosity in relation to human height. I'm sure somebody's doing it. So I think the take-home lesson of this talk is that actually people really are stop trying everything twice. They're no longer going in for incest. Given that, it seems to me obvious we should all have to take up folk dancing. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.